The work that I'm going to be talking about is based on a paper that I co-authored with Karen Wixon and David Pearson on this concept that we call text-task scenarios. And if I get some very hard questions at the end, I'll just give them to David. So with that, I'd like to begin by talking about what we want to do here today. So my goal in today's presentation is to push our thinking beyond this concept of text complexity to understanding what we call the comprehension of complex text. And I'll try to make those distinctions clear in the next couple of slides. So I'll begin with a short discussion of just what that means, comprehension of complex texts. I'll offer some examples from studies that demonstrate the influence of tasks on comprehension, and then move to a couple of examples that might help us think about how we might put this into action in classrooms and in instruction. So let me begin with three terms that I'd like to distinguish here. The first is text complexity, and I think we're all pretty familiar with that since the Common Core has come on board. In my view, text complexity, it is surely a change from our concept of text difficulty of the past. As we're all aware, Common Core pushes us to read more closely, to read more critically, to deal with greater amounts of text, both in print and digitally, to read thoughtfully, to build knowledge through reading, and to engage in thoughtful reasoning and thinking about text. So that term text complexity, I believe, is a very important shift in the way that we thought about text difficulty in years past. Text level or text difficulty, I'm distinguishing from text complexity in thinking about how we did in the past calculate text difficulty using typical readability formulas, things that took into account word length, sentence length, and structural features like those. I do want to acknowledge that Mesmer, Cunningham, and Hebert point out that they do not want to equate text difficulty with text complexity. They in a very good article in Reading Research Quarterly, they talk about text difficulty as being the outcome of reading. That is, how a reader interacts with the text and how easy or hard that text is. Here I want to just think about difficulty as being more traditional measures of text, and text complexity is taking into account other features of text. Finally, I want to think about the idea of comprehension of complex text. So the goal here must be that we want to think about comprehension as the outcome. Text complexity by itself is not what we're really looking for. What we really want to have happen is that readers are able to understand complex text. And the importance of that becomes clear in a couple of ways. First, students have to develop the reading skills and strategies and stamina they need to fully and deeply comprehend text. And they need to be able to respond to a variety of demands and audiences. They can't do that unless they engage with complex text and unless they're supported by good instruction. Second, the act of deeply understanding such texts and learning from them is foundational to building new knowledge, which is essential. And finally, most importantly, as I mentioned, text complexity is not an end into itself. The purpose is not simply to have complex texts in schools. It is to help students become able to comprehend complex texts. So, with that, let's think about where this concept of complexity and reading comprehension come together. For that, I want to take us back to the RAND study group, the RAND reading study group, and their definition of reading comprehension. Their definition of reading comprehension was stated as the process of simultaneously extracting and constructing meaning through interaction and involvement with written language. We use the words extracting and constructing to emphasize both the importance and insufficiency of the text as a determinant of reading comprehension. So as this graphic shows, reading comprehension is the interaction of not simply the text, but the text, the reader, the activity, all in a socio-cultural context that shapes and is shaped by the reader and by the text. So this interaction is central to the RAND model. For example, we would expect that students reading a similar passage, for example, of Mice and Men by Steinbeck, with its conversation and its flavor, we would expect those students in second and third grade to read that quite differently than we would expect students in fifth grade. Even though it has a readability of about second or third grade, we would expect that it would present a challenge for fifth grade students who were asked to reflect on the higher levels of meaning, like friendship and loyalty and intellect. But if we change the context and we provided more support for students, we put them together in groups, we had them discuss and perhaps even decide what a good book jacket would look like for that, we would change the comprehension outcome still. So this idea of reading comprehension as interactive is not new to us, but it seems to get lost every time we have a renewed emphasis on text. Text seems to take priority over what we have known for a long time about this interaction. So texts play an important role in comprehension, but just a partial role. In fact, depending on the criterion variable used to scale text, some studies suggest that text itself can explain only about 35 to 65% of the variance in comprehension outcomes. So the rest of comprehension is contributed by these other variables. So now let's look at how text complexity is put into play in the Common Core standards. Our goal here is to understand how text complexity is communicated and how it may either force us to look too much at the text and not enough at other factors that come into play. As many of you are aware, text complexity is dealt with at length in Appendix A of the Common Core standards. They also deal quite extensively with the RAND model and the multidimensional interactive nature of reading. Nevertheless, the document of the Common Core and many of those who interpret it seem to focus disproportionately on the text itself. So we wondered why in the world that might be. So to get some ideas about why this overemphasis on text, when we know about these other factors, we looked to the document itself. First, we looked at Appendix A and the definition of text complexity. This graphic, which we've all seen over many different occasions, depicts three sources for establishing the complexity of a text. The qualitative dimensions, like the levels of meaning, the structure, the language, conventionality, clarity, knowledge demands. The quantitative dimensions, which we typically think about in terms of readability formulas, such as word length and frequency and text cohesion, that are difficult, if not impossible, for human readers to evaluate efficiently. And then finally, at the bottom of the triangle, the reader text dimensions. Things that are particular to readers, such as motivation, knowledge, experiences, and particular tasks, such as purpose and complexity of the tasks. These descriptions appear under a heading called a three-part model for measuring text complexity. However, if we look at that graphic and we think back to the RAND model, the RAND graphic, we can see that this graphic more accurately represents a model of comprehension of complex text than text complexity itself. Yet by elevating only the words text complexity to this section heading, this appendix for the Common Core privileges text over the other factors in this model. In addition, just from a visual perspective, the text is privileged. If we look at it, 2/3 of the area inside that triangle is allocated to the text dimensions, qualitative and quantitative, but only 1/3 of the area is devoted to this combination of reader and text, and context isn't even depicted. Following this explanation in the Common Core, we find 3 full pages describing the qualitative and quantitative measures of text complexity, and yet just a half a page devoted to reader and text. So simply in terms of the visuals and the proportion of text that is devoted in the Common Core to this idea of text complexity, we can see that it kind of skews our thinking toward the text rather than toward comprehension of the text. To their credit, the Common Core people actually do a nice job of providing several examples about how we take into consideration qualitative measures, quantitative measures, and they acknowledge the role of the reader and task factors. However, if we look at that, what we see is that those reader and task factors are dealt with fairly generically and in a boilerplate kind of way. That is, they say that these reader and task factors are to be determined locally with reference to such variables as students' motivation, knowledge, experiences, as well as purpose and the complexity of the task assigned and the questions posed. So it seems to me that I can understand why it's difficult to deal with the reader factors because they are so variable. But it seems a little less understandable not to deal more directly with issues of task. Because in some ways, just like text almost stands still and can be analyzed, tasks can stand still and be analyzed. Readers, on the other hand, seem to move around quite a bit. So let's look at the other aspects of the Common Core to understand why this disproportionate emphasis on text. For that, we'll now look at some examples from Appendix B, where there are exemplars of the quality and complexity of appropriate texts at specific grade spans. At the end of each grade level band, we're provided with exemplars of what Common Core calls performance tasks, intended to illustrate the application of specific standards to the texts of sufficient complexity, quality, and range. What we see when we look at these two examples is that all the performance tasks offered are treated as if they're equally complex. So to look more closely here at the grade 4-5 band under literary text, we see that the first one, which comes from Alice in Wonderland, which has a Lexile level of 860, which puts it right in the mid-range of this grade, asks students to make connections between visual representation, that is the pictures in Alice in Wonderland, and the text story to identify how the pictures of Alice reflect specific descriptions of her. Compare that, if you will, to the next example at the same grade level band of a task that asks students to compare and contrast coming-of-age stories, two different coming-of-age stories. One, Bud Not Buddy. The second, The Birch Bark House, by identifying similar themes and examining the story's approach to the topic of growing up. Now, it seems to me, even without the text in front of us, which is one of the things that makes this text-task relationship difficult to talk about on a webinar, and that is that we don't have the full text in front of us. But it seems to me, from knowing these texts and looking at these tasks, that these are quite different in terms of what they expect the reader to do. In the first case, the reader is asked to look at illustrations and to look at how the text itself maps onto those illustrations, or vice versa. But in the second, the reader is asked to read two full stories to understand the stories at the deeper level of themes, and then to examine that theme and how it's treated differently across the two texts. If we just think about the amount of time, for example, that it would take a reader to deal with those, we can see that one would require quite a bit more time, not to mention deeper levels of thinking. This next example is interesting as well. This is another example from the Common Core that looks at a performance task. This performance task at the level 6 to 8 asks students to determine the point of view of John Adams in his letter on Thomas Jefferson and analyze how he distinguishes his position from an alternative approach articulated by Thomas Jefferson. Well, just getting through that task seems like just getting through the reading of the directions of the task seemed like a major accomplishment. And if you look at the Lexile level, again, it falls squarely in the 6-8 range, but it is a difficult text. So one would think that this would be quite a difficult task. But if you bear with me a moment, I want to show you what that task actually looks like. Remember, we want to distinguish the point of view of John Adams and how he distinguishes his position from an alternative approach articulated by Thomas Jefferson. What you see in front of you is the actual letter from John Adams to Pickering. Pickering was an official, and it was this letter, a 752-word letter, was written from John Adams to Pickering in 1822, some 46 years after the Declaration of Independence was signed, and after Adams and Jefferson were out of office, and after Pickering had retired. It's a very complex letter with allusions to historical events and obscure dated language. So the Common Core task is not an easy one. As we saw, it's very difficult to get through just the directions on the task. However, when we look closely at this text, we can see that the answer to this task is confined to a very small passage, paragraph, highlighted here in yellow, with very common, easy to read language. Quite clear about what the differences of opinion might be. So although what we see is that, in fact, the task looks hard, the text that is needed to actually respond to this is quite confined and quite simple. So if we look across these, what we notice about the Common Core and their attention to text complexity is that they're focused on the reading of complex text. Here they've pointed out to us that sometimes tasks might require students to read harder text than they normally would be required to. Common Core then tells teachers, conversely, teachers who have had success using particular texts that are easier than those required for a given grade level band should feel free to continue to use them as long as the general movement during a given school year is toward texts of higher level complexity. So the point here is that all the emphasis in the Common Core seems to be aimed at ensuring that students actually encounter sufficient complex text, but less about whether or not they understand it. So going back to the RAND model and what we know about comprehension, I want to remind us that what we know about comprehension is that it is the interaction of text complexity with task complexity with the reader that results in comprehension. Currently, there's been an overemphasis on the text complexity without equal consideration of task complexity, the reader. So what we argue in this paper is that text complexity and task complexity can come together along with reader factors to produce comprehension in something that we've called a text-task scenario. That is, how tasks interact with the text. So in general, we call this TTS, or text-task scenario. We define it as a reading selection or even a pair of reading selections and some tasks that accompany them. They might be the sort of tasks that are part of an instructional event or a curriculum unit or even an assessment. They're designed to tap a variety of purposes for reading, a variety of text types, and comprehension tasks that, when they're taken together, more or less define what has to happen for comprehension to take place. So text selection might include different literary or discipline-specific, out-of-school, in-school texts. They might include texts at different levels of complexity or topics or genres or structures. And the tasks themselves might include a variety of kinds of tasks. For example, the purpose of the task might differ depending on the developmental level of the kids, even if they're reading the same level task. The same level text. For example, a second grader might read Cinderella to be able to retell a plot, and the fifth grader might read it to compare culturally distinct Cinderella narratives. And an 11th grader might read the very same text to unearth a dominant gendered ideology. So, to summarize, the text task scenario allows us to simultaneously consider the complexity of the text and the complexity of the task. And as a result, we're more likely to accurately represent the challenge and the complexity of the comprehension act. And we're more likely to anticipate the kind of instruction that will facilitate student success. Perhaps even more important, unlike the undifferentiated approach to reader and task that we see in the Common Core, the specificity of a text task scenario is more likely to help educators and curricular developers consider even the reader factors and the context factors. So from here, I'd like to move on to looking at some examples illustrating text task scenarios with some data, because the choice of the task is no small matter. This chart shows the task variables and categories that are typically used in NAEP. In NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, we have texts of different types, different levels, and different kinds of tasks. Here, the tasks may be called the response mode. There are multiple choice tasks, short constructed response tasks, and extended tasks where students need to write longer responses to more in-depth questions. There are also a variety of cognitive targets or levels of thinking represented in tasks. In NAEP, we have tasks that are often categorized as locate and recall, sometimes also referred to as literal level kinds of questions. The next level, more likely to be interpretive or integrate across larger bits of text. And finally, items that ask students to critique and evaluate. So let's look at the data from several released reading blocks and look at how the task and the text interact with one another. In the chart on the left, you'll see the results of 4th, 5th grade NAEP passages, 4th grade data. In the first column, you'll see that the LR, or the literal level questions, followed by inferential integration questions, and then at the bottom we see a couple of higher level questions. In the middle column, you'll see the nature of the response. And finally, under score, you'll see an E for an easy item, done with thousands and thousands of students, M for a middle range difficulty item, and H for a very difficult or hard level item. What's so interesting with these data is that we have a single measure of text complexity here. And in NAEP, it's not just lexiles. They use a combination of other qualitative factors to situate a text at a particular grade level. But what we see is that even within a text, the same text with the same lexile, the same placement, we see items or tasks that range from very, very easy, up in the range of 80% of the students get it right, down to very, very difficult items. So the tasks will determine, in interaction with the text, how difficult comprehension will be. What's also interesting about this is that we might assume that multiple choice items are always easier for students than are more extended responses. But even here we see that sometimes multiple choice items can be among the most difficult. We also see that sometimes literal level items can be quite difficult, and that integration and inference items span the range from easy to middle to hard. The point of these data is to demonstrate that when texts are allocated a particular complexity level, either a lexile reading, readability reading, even a qualitative determination of difficulty, the kinds of tasks we ask students to engage in changes the nature of the level of comprehension. This next chart is also drawn from NAEP data, and this points out a slightly different interaction between text and task. These three passages, Tough as a Daisy, Marian Anderson, and Daddy Daycare, are all to be found on a 4th grade National Assessment of Educational Progress. Now, remembering that NAEP uses a combination of quantitative and qualitative data to place passages, we can see that there's quite a range in lexiles, but that they all appear on 4th grade. More interestingly, here we see that although all of them have a mix of easy, middle, and hard, just like our last ones did, the lexile levels for these three passages, all placed at 4th grade level, are widely different. So we see that there are differences within passages as well as across passages. Tasks make a difference. So what does this all mean for us in terms of text task scenarios in the classroom and implications for instruction? First, I hope it's clear that texts alone do not determine how complex the reading comprehension task is. The whole process of reading comprehension is an interaction of text and task. The variables that we think are beginning to appear in the literature that seem to influence outcomes related to tasks have to do with the amount, quality, structure, and location of the text needed to respond. For example, if a student is given the task that we saw in Thomas Jefferson and only has to read a short paragraph, the easiest one, I would argue, in that entire letter to Pickering, then it changes the nature of how complex the comprehension event is. Sometimes we only have to look for individual items. Sometimes we have to read across the entire passage. Sometimes we only have to skim or scan. Second, the nature of comprehension is influenced by the number, the distance, the types of inferential leaps that we ask readers to make. How many gaps do they need to fill in? How many lines do they need to read between? Are those connections over large bits of text or smaller bits of text? Third, data, especially data from the adult literacy analysis, shows that text search seems to be influencing comprehension in terms of tasks. Whether or not the task requires the reader to look at text features or aspects of genre that are unique, purposes for reading, specificity of the task, and just how closely the task is aligned to the actual text that we have to read. All of these variables are variables that we can control inside a classroom. They are variables that we can use to reframe tasks that we give students as they grapple with texts of various levels of complexity. I'll share just a couple of examples with you now of how we might even think during instruction about reframing text-task relationships. This again is from NAEP, from a 1994 selection on the lost people of Mesa Verde, the Anastasi. Originally, the task that was given had no purpose. Students were just simply told, read this and answer questions. But imagine changing the purpose and the task so that students had a focus for reading, so that they knew what type of text this was and what they were expected to do with the information. Just shaping a task like that is likely to help students approach and understand a complex text. Another existing task was posed here. The 3 moves made by the Anastasi are listed below and explain the reasons that were suggested in the article for each move. Some of you might recall that the Anastasi moved around quite a bit. That kind of task leaves readers little at loose ends trying to figure out where to go for those reasons or what the point of asking this question might be. But a possible revision might be around helping them understand that these are theories about why people moved around. Again, shaping the purpose, shaping students to be able to think about their approach to the task in reference to the text is likely to increase comprehension. Let me move on and close with 2 examples that come from the assessments that are being developed by Park and by Smarter Balance. I share these with you because it's clear to me that the issue for students as they interact with these new tests is not simply one of reading more difficult texts. The issue is going to be how the texts interact with these tasks. In this case, not only are students asked to find the main idea, but they're asked to pick out support, a very different kind of task than they typically get. In another performance task, students are given 35 minutes to read an article, watch a video, and then they're asked to not only take notes, but to answer 3 questions from the sources. If you just look at the nature of these kinds of tasks, it'll become apparent that we need to do a much better job of helping students think about not just approaching the text, but approaching the task. Let me move forward then for my last two slides. The other piece that I think text-task relationships and text-task scenarios might add to our thinking is a new way to think about reading strategies. One way to think about this is, how does the reader adapt to meet a range of text and task scenarios? Almost like an eye doctor eye test. Does this reader do better when the task is framed one way and the text is of a particular difficulty? And can that reader then change strategies for a new task with the very same text? Under what conditions is the reader able to read well? And how can instruction help students to manipulate both strategies and approaches to meet the demands of text and tasks? Final thought, I want to urge us to never think about text complexity in isolation from the reading task, the reader, and the context. I think simply telling students to try harder or to read more closely as they encounter these new, more challenging texts is unlikely to improve comprehension. In my mind, our instruction must take into account the various ways in which the text and the task and the reader come together. And teachers can address all of those factors, not just the text factors, during instruction. And they can facilitate learning by manipulating text-task scenarios to accommodate students' needs.